I was a extremely self-absorbed materialist atheist. Pretty quickly got burnt out on alcohol. Then when my friend had psilocybin mushrooms, I didn't have any hesitation at all.
Your first experience with psychedelics. Tell us about your first trip.
They aren't addictive in the same mechanism that something like heroin, but I think they are. You get addicted to that spiritual high.
Bob Mortimer, just this one time, he took LSD basically. It turned him into a kind of reclusive, anxiety-ridden person for about 3 or 4 years.
Bad trips were really, really bad. Years after I quit, there were still trips that would make my palms sweat if I thought about them.
What are you actually tapping into then?
There's definitely something spiritual happening. I think just because there is a chemical reality, that doesn't preclude the existence of there being a corresponding spiritual reality.
It's the limitless. But what feels like might be their absolute nightmare is if someone came to them and said, no, now pin that down to one specific religious tradition, please. Was it a bit of that as well?
This podcast is supported by Stewardship, helping Christians be the best stewards of the resources God gives them.
Radical generosity has always been central to the Christian story, and stewardship can help make it part of everyday life.
For decades, Stewardship has helped Christians give in ways that are simple, flexible, and deeply rooted in faith. They help you give well and see your generosity make a real difference.
A Stewardship Giving Account gives you one place to manage all of your giving, regular and one-off, available 24/7.
You can set aside funds for future giving, respond quickly when urgent needs arise, and see clearly how your generosity is making a difference over time.
Discover more at stewardship.org.uk.
Well, welcome back to Re-Enchanting, the show where we chart the ways in which our materialistic post-Christian culture is nevertheless craving the mystical and the meaningful, in short, a re-enchanted world. We've been on a bit of a summer break, so this is our first episode of Season 8. I'm Justin Briley.
And I'm Belle Tinzel.
And we have a show to kick off this season that really is actually emblematic, I think, of the way in which re-enchantment is entering our culture as we look at the boom in psychedelics with our guest, Ashley Lande.
Indeed, we are so excited. So just to introduce Ashley is an artist and an author whose book, The Thing That Would Make Everything Okay Forever, for those watching, this is it, which tells her story of using psychedelics as what we would call a search for re-enchantment, and her journey to faith in Jesus as she began to encounter the dark side of trips and transcendent experiences.
Yeah, so welcome along, Ashley, to the show. Great to have you with us.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
Well, we're really looking forward to talking about the book, about your journey, and about, in general, the interest that's really arisen in recent years around psychedelics and their potential value. But we'll obviously talk about some of the potential challenges and harms along the way. But we always begin with the same question for all of our guests, wherever they are in the world, and that is, what are you currently reading?
Yes, and normally I would love that question. I just had a baby in April though, so my reading
so
is
torture.
not. Yes,
Yeah.
my reading is not quite what it normally is. But I did just read a really interesting book called The Transhumanist Temptation by Grayson Quay, and it was a really excellent overview of ways of thinking about transhumanism from a Christian perspective, and he gave just a really great overview of the advances that are occurring and the advances that people in the transhumanist movement are hoping will occur, and kind of relating that and thinking of that biblically. And he talked a little bit about psychedelics as well. Yeah. And I've noticed there are more things starting to emerge about, as far as thinking about transhumanism, AI, psychedelics from a Christian perspective. So I found that really helpful, just a really
It feels like
overview.
that term is coming into common parlance more and more, transhumanism. It was something I hadn't really bumped into 4 or 5 years ago. But yeah, it feels like maybe, Belle, we need a conversation here on Re-Enchanting about transhumanism,
Indeed.
modifying ourselves.
Give me nightmares. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Sorry, I think you were about to mention another book as well, Ashley.
Oh, no, that's fine. Yeah, it's definitely coming into vogue. I think just because the interest in transhumanism and the movements are accelerating. And I remember several years ago, there just wasn't much out there from a Christian perspective about transhumanism. But I did read another book by Jacob Schatzer, I think, and he made a really convincing argument that it wouldn't be a far leap from smartphones to having some kind of implant. And that really made me want to throw away my smartphone, but I didn't. But
Yeah.
and I've also been rereading, just as far as fiction, I've been rereading a book called The Quincunx by Charles Palliser, which is one of my favorite books. It's like a very Dickensian mystery that's like 800, 900 pages long. So having had a baby, I'm just rereading that in small installments, but it's just a really enjoyable read.
Your book, Ashley, is so beautiful. I have so thoroughly enjoyed reading it. It's one of those, because obviously we have to read a lot for re-enchanting. So my hope is always that I'll like be able to like really rush through a book, and yours is too good for that. It's too good. Not that it's not a super quick read, like it is, but it's too good for me to not want to pore over every page. And also the subject matter, I think, both professionally, this is something I think about an awful lot, but also personally, like people I love, people I do life with, people I was in school with, people I'm so close to. This link between spiritual experience and psychedelics is sort of in every circle I feel like I'm in. So really, I just want to pick your brain selfishly for me today. So I would love, we have so much to ask you. I think I would love to just ask a little bit about your first experience with psychedelics, because then I want to ask you about what led to it. But if we just start there, like what was your first experience with psychedelic drug? Tell us about your first trip.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for all those kind words about my book. I really appreciate that. It's very encouraging. But the first time for me, I didn't necessarily have an interest in psychedelics. It was maybe, gosh, it must have been 15 years ago. So there wasn't really this, I mean, psychedelics have always stuck around in American culture since the 60s, but they weren't experiencing a moment like they are now. And it was my senior year in college. I was tired of partying with alcohol, really burnt out on that. And one of my good friends said that he had some psilocybin mushrooms. So I just thought, why not? I didn't really know that much about them. I knew psychedelics were associated with hippies in the 60s, but I was just very naive about what they actually did and what the actual effects were. And so just went into it totally blind. And that first time I had what seemed like a very good time. It was just fun. It was interesting. It was fascinating. I enjoyed all of the visual distortions and hallucinations and like auditory distortions, listening to different kinds of music on it. And I was hanging out with a few of my friends and yeah, I just thought it was fascinating. At that point, there really wasn't a spiritual element to it for me. I didn't have a spiritual awakening on that trip. I still would have said that I was an atheist. I would have maybe been slightly leaning slightly more toward agnosticism after that, just because it was something that I never experienced before, and it felt immaterial. Like it felt like there was something else going on there, but it didn't. It didn't like profoundly change my worldview that very first time.
What was your worldview? If you could, maybe you didn't even particularly describe a worldview at that point, but what in a sense, what kind of a person were you by the time you got to the point of beginning to experiment with psychedelics?
I was a extremely self-absorbed materialist atheist who didn't really think through the logical implications of like materialist atheism, and may have even at some point called myself a nihilist, but there again also didn't like critically think through those things. So I guess you could say I was one uncritical atheist. Like I just kind of decided I was going to reject everything religious, anything I had been brought up with, but I didn't have a really a foundation of anything else. Yeah.
Had that kind of, had there been any sort of spiritual religious kind of background, growing up? Was there any kind of God influence in your life up to that point?
Yeah, I was raised going to a Methodist church, and I wouldn't say that our belief in God was always kind of a background belief that we knew was there. I remember being scandalized the first time that I found out I have an older half brother who's 15 years older than me, being scandalized the first time I found out that he didn't believe in God. I was like, but you can't do that. You're not allowed to not believe in God. I was maybe 10 or 11. And so we did go to church a lot of Sundays. I wouldn't say it was like a really robust part of our life otherwise, except that it was, a background belief. And I had a very good childhood in many ways. But when I hear from, other friends who were raised in the Christian faith about like praying and reading the Bible at home, that wasn't really a part of our lives. But I'm grateful there was a foundation, but it was just pretty easy for me to reject it when I was 14, 15 and exploring different ideas, reading a lot of different things. And atheism seemed cool and rebellious. And it seemed like no great loss for me to reject something that I didn't really ever fully understand or grasp. So
that's so interesting, because when reading your book, even in the prologue, you're at the point where you're growing your own mushrooms. And there is such a palpable sense of your like absolute desperation for more, like this moreness, something more than what is in front of you, something more than your five senses can offer you. And so I assumed that was just your disposition always, that you were always someone who was like, there has to be more than than the left hemisphere of my brain is telling me there is. So if that wasn't the case, can you tell us a little bit about how you got to that place where psychedelics weren't just something you were trying at a party because they didn't give you as bad of a hangover as alcohol maybe, and became something that you started to call, like, you write about the mushrooms you're growing, that you call them your manna, which is so like poetic and interesting. So how did you get from A to B in regards to psychedelic use?
I guess I should say there always was that hunger for more. I was just eager to run after it in all the wrong places. I felt like my the Methodist church of my upbringing, which I'm sure was full of wonderful people, but I didn't get it. I didn't experience the Holy Spirit. I didn't understand the gospel, and that, no fault of my family or anyone else, but I did want more. I did seek transcendence, but I just decided to go looking for it in all the wrong places. And so I think after I got to college, and I was always like a very good child growing up, I always got straight A's. When the opportunity came to rebel in college, I just kind of went full bore with it. But pretty quickly, well, after a few years anyway, got burnt out on alcohol because it had such a high cost to it, partying. You did feel that loss of inhibition. You did feel that momentary freedom, but there was such a high cost to it in so many ways. And so, once I got burnt out on that, and like I said, when my friend had psilocybin mushrooms, I was just kind of didn't have any hesitation at all. I'd vaguely heard of people having bad trips, but I just wasn't really worried or aware of that. And so, and it did give me, like I said, there was nothing necessarily intensely spiritual about that first time, but it did give me, I guess, a hunger for more of whatever that was that I just experienced, that I had never experienced before, which did feel transcendent. It felt like something outside of, like I said, outside of any prior experience, outside of normal consciousness. And so it did, even though it wasn't spiritually profound, it made me hunger for more.
For those who maybe are kind of newbies on all of this, they may hear the word drugs and think heroin, cannabis, whatever. What's distinctive about the psychedelic forms of drugs? I'm assuming, first of all, they aren't necessarily in a sense as addictive as some really hard drugs like heroin and cocaine and so on. But I suppose they have a form of addiction in themselves because of the kind of experience that you were craving as well, actually.
Yeah, for sure. And I feel like that kind of ties in. I know this is a question that might have come up later, like how the church should respond to seekers who have taken psychedelics, because a lot of Christians, wonderful Christians I know who grew up in the faith and never really strayed, they would categorize, they just think, oh, it's a drug, it's the same as, you know, any other type of drug, heroin, cocaine, etc. And it's true that they aren't addictive in the same by the same mechanism that something like heroin or cocaine, that's just like dumping dopamine into your system, would be addictive. But I think, of course, psychedelics proponents would say that they aren't addictive at all. I think that they are, but it's definitely in a different way. You get addicted to that spiritual high, addicted to experiencing something outside of normal consciousness. And I think for me, it also became an addiction to as far as like not wanting to just do daily mundane life. You know, it was something, it was a way to get out of that. And it was an escape hatch. And even when I had a bad experience, like, well, it was something outside of, you know, just having to get up and do what I'm supposed to do every day.
Yeah, I mean, you write very, very, very well in the book about this kind of, you almost had two different worlds you lived in, you know, this mundane everyday world where you just had to get through the chores and the job or whatever, but you could escape essentially to this world of the psychedelic, and where everything seemed important and meaningful, and you know, you were part of something cosmic. But as you say, not always necessarily a positive trip. You know, you had these bad trips. So what was like, I mean, again, could you briefly explain like what would maybe encapsulate a kind of a positive trip versus a bad trip when you were, you know, having these trips in, as it were, in your downtime when you weren't having to do a quote unquote the normal world?
Yeah, and that feeling was very seductive. Like there was something cosmic at stake. Like you were part of this grand cosmic drama, and like, you know, what you did or failed to do would affect things on, you know, a huge scale. And I think the really good trips that I had, I would feel kind of this, like loss of identity, but loss of identity in a pleasant way, as opposed to a bad trip would be loss of identity in a very unpleasant way. Kind of absorption into the world around you. Like I would liken it to, I think that's why people who do psychedelics are so attracted to like Buddhist and Hindu concepts of kind of being absorbed into this oceanic consciousness. So there would be feelings of that, feelings of having special revelations that no one else understood, feeling, and ironically with, you know, ego death is talked about so much in relation to psychedelics, but there would also be this ego inflation of feeling like you'd had this experience that other people hadn't had, and that this, you know, special revelation had been vouchsafed to you through this experience that other people, you know, normies didn't have. And so that was very, very seductive. And there was a high, obviously, that went along with the good trips. There could be very beautiful geometric fractalized visuals, and as an artist I always really enjoyed that. So yeah, a good trip felt like you were breaking through to something, you know, that you were understanding something secret and esoteric and amazing, but you could never articulate what that was, you know, or if you tried to articulate it, it would just be like everything is everything, you know, and the all is all, like things that don't actually make sense when you try to bring them down to a foundational level. And then, of course, there'd be the inevitable coming down after the trip, you know, when you're kind of second guessing yourself, like, did I really understand what I thought I understood? What did that really mean? Sometimes I would try to write things down at the peak of my trip, and then I would read them later and be like, yeah, that really doesn't make sense. I knew it made a lot of sense at the time. So,
but just to finish the point so these were kind of what constituted a good trip, but the bad trip, I mean, you say that this sense of ego death, which is, as you say, common in a lot of these transcendent experiences, whether through some form of meditation or psychedelics or whatever. What was the bad version of that? When were you scared, if you like, in a bad trip?
and it took me years. I never thought I would write about this subject because years after I quit, there were still trips that would like make my palms sweat if I thought about them. And so I didn't want to think about psychedelics or talk about psychedelics, but now I feel like I have enough distance, and God has been so gracious to heal me enough that I can think about it. But yeah, I just had some really horrific trips just where you feel like everything is lost forever. You're never going to recover sanity. You're never going to be in touch with reality again. Like you're just careening off into space and you're never coming back. And your identity is fracturing, falling apart. There's just no solid ground to stand on. And everything is falling apart, like in perpetuity forever. Like, I mean, I just use the word hell. Like it was certainly a hellish feeling. And like you were fundamentally separated. You know, at the time I wouldn't have understood like separation from God, although I might have used language like separation from source or separation from the universe. But there was also this chasm between you and other people. And like I said, between you and reality, between you and any feeling of love or sanity or wholeness. And yeah, they were terrible. Bad trips were really, really bad. I'm kind of shocked that I didn't quit after my first bad trip, but I didn't.
Yeah, because they were bad for a while, right? Like they
Yeah.
were a few years where they were relentlessly bad. So
It was, yeah, they back and forth, but then it was overall, I say it was like a downward trajectory toward the end where it was like I couldn't have a good trip anymore, try as I might.
I have so many questions about like what you think is happening in those moments and what you would say to others. But before that, my deepest and most pertinent question, you write about a trip in which you become Bob Dylan. And so my question is, Ashley, what does it feel like to be Bob Dylan, obviously?
Well, apparently it was wonderful. Yeah. I mean, I was listening to his music and I was like, I remember I was dancing and writhing on the floor and I felt like I was one with Bob Dylan, which there again, you know, it's a little frightening to think you can have these delusional thoughts that are like, feel so real. And, you know, I've brought it up before, and psychedelics proponents really dislike this when you bring it up, but like Charles Manson loved LSD, you know, and he had a conviction that, you know, he should do or prompt others to do what they did. He had, you know, very evil convictions. And I think like LSD can, and he's certainly not the only one who has had very evil convictions on psychedelics, but like I said, the feeling can feel so powerful and so real. Like this is really real. This is realer than real. And you think and me and other people think you're receiving messages directly from God, commands from God to do things. And so, yeah, I mean, that night that I thought I became Bob Dylan, I'm not going to lie, it felt fun. It felt interesting. It felt like I was communing with Bob Dylan, but obviously I wasn't. Bob Dylan was sitting thousands of miles away doing whatever Bob Dylan does in his downtime. But yeah, I think that just goes to show though the extent of like how powerful that delusion is. And maybe it's something relatively harmless unless I had gone on to stalk Bob Dylan. I don't know, but it can also be something incredibly evil and harmful. But it's really strong, like I said.
Can I ask, because I'm really interested in like the light and the shade of this topic and trying to understand the craving, it sort of from many angles. And so would you be able to name some of the, like beyond the high, which is like tantalizing and addictive and in its own way. And, you know, friends of mine talk about it a bit like Pandora's box. So like we'll be having an experience and they'll be like, you have no idea how good this could be. You know, like we're at this level, we could be at this level. And it's like, once you know that that level exists, this level, you know, the sober level just never competes. There is no comparison. So I know that that is there, but I'm also wondering if there are like some deep and true and innate cravings within us, some stuff that we were designed to have that are also leading people to use psychedelics.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I absolutely think so. Like, we are spiritual. God made us that way. God gave us a thirst for him that is misdirected in all kinds of ways. And I wanted to say too, like, the Pandora's box, like, you could be up here and here, well, you can also be down here, and down here is
Sure.
terrifying.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I've often thought, like, I just feel like a bad trip is a psychological burden that God did not design human beings to bear. So, but yeah, absolutely. I think that everyone hungers and thirsts for transcendence in some ways, and it's just readily apparent looking out into the world, all the sinful ways in which people try to satisfy that. And unfortunately, I do think psychedelics is one of those sinful ways that God has not ordained for us to use. But yeah, absolutely. I think, and I think, you know, our like the way that God has created us individually can make us hunger and thirst for specific means of transcendence. Is kind of like the dark side of the gifts that God has given us. Or I think for me, just because I am artistic, I am, it was so appealing to me. Psychedelics were so appealing to me.
Yeah, it's really helpful to hear all of that, Ashley. And the question that's been going around in my head though is what are you actually tapping into then in this psychedelic moment? Because there is a craving, as Belle says, for re-enchantment, for the spiritual. But what sort of a spirituality do you think you're sort of effectively tapping into? Now, some people might say, well, there's actually nothing quote unquote spiritual happening. Your brain's kind of firing off in all kinds of ways, but it's chemistry essentially. Whereas obviously most people who actually experience psychedelics, even, and I've actually met people who have said to me before they took psychedelics, they would have said, oh, it's just a chemical experience in your brain. Once they took psychedelics, they changed their mind and said, no, that was such a radically different experience that I now believe in some kind of spiritual reality. They might not put a particular name on it, but they believe they've encountered something outside of just, neurons firing in their brain. So what's your position on that? What do you think is happening both in the brain and in a kind of more spiritual realm when people do psychedelics?
Yeah, I think that there's definitely something spiritual happening. I think just because there is a chemical reality, that doesn't preclude the existence of there being a corresponding spiritual reality for everything. So, as Christians, we believe the spiritual realm is always active. And so I believe that there's absolutely something real occurring. And I think I got an email just recently, or I did an interview for Comment magazine with Matthew Milliner, and he forwarded me an email that he got from a man who said that he read the interview, and he had a really fascinating story. He said he took psychedelics decades ago, was very into psychedelics, and was not a Christian, and took them for a few months, and then one night on psychedelics had a very powerful experience of Jesus appearing to him and saying, like, I have been spiritually covering you and protecting you for these past few months, and I'm not going to do that anymore. And I just thought that was really fascinating. And he said he should have become a Christian immediately after that, but he didn't. And he persisted in tripping, and he started to have bad trips, and encounters with spiritual entities who were clearly evil. And I just thought that was really fascinating. And I think about too, all this, pretty much all the studies that have been done on the therapeutic value of psychedelics have had really small sample sizes. There was a pretty famous one that came out of or several that have come out of Johns Hopkins that have had lots of ethical issues with the studies. But sometimes people would say, oh, like this psilocybin experience is like top 5 spiritual experiences, like on par with the birth of my child, which I find really, really sad. And I wonder, like, what is happening when you're taking a chemical that is activating the meaning making systems of your brain, whatever they are. And I'm sure we don't yet know the ins and outs of what exactly is happening chemically when you, but you're taking something that's activating those systems with no corresponding reality that has meaning. Whereas like the birth of your child, God designed that to have meaning. God designed that to be intensely meaningful. And so it's alarming to think that those meaning making centers or chemicals, like I said, I don't know, whatever they are being activated, and they can kind of attach to anything. Like, for a humorous example, I remember when my husband and I met my husband at our acid dealer's house, and we fell in love very quickly. We tripped together all the time, and we would walk late at night. And I remember it felt like we would always see like one single sock or one single glove in the road. And we'd always be like, oh, that explains so much. Like that's why this and this happened. That's why this and this happened. Because it's like, there's a Christian, he calls himself a neurotheologian, Jim Wilder. I asked him about this, and he said his theory was that, and LSD and many other psychedelics are, I think the word is serotonergic, so they're like increasing the serotonin in your brain. And he said serotonin is a big part of like the meaning making system of your brain. So when serotonin is just being dumped, like the meaning is going to attach to anything, and what it attaches to, like, who knows?
It could be a sock in the road. Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
Yeah. And it was.
I mean, that's really interesting because since, we've had a conversation before, and I've done a couple of other conversations with people who have looked into psychedelics and experienced psychedelics. And one of the things I come away with is perhaps one analogy for psychedelics is it's kind of like a shortcut to transcendence, in the way that maybe a diet pill, these Ozempic, pills and things that can help you shed weight really quickly. But you don't have to like change your eating habits or do more exercise or anything. It's kind of like it just acts on the body. So you don't have to develop any healthy habits. You just kind of get this shortcut to it. And likewise, for some people feel like I've just had a truly meaningful transcendent experience, but they haven't had to do any of the hard work of actually creating a world around themselves or habits or practices that actually open up the possibility of having a baby or prayer or whatever it might be. And I just wonder whether there's something about that's part of the allure of psychedelics. It's like we all want, fast track to whatever it is, but we get it on the wrong terms. We get it on these very sort of, you haven't actually had to do any of the work that normally goes into the payoff of that experience, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. That is very well put. That is exactly it. And I think that's why too, people, when they first start taking psychedelics, unless they have a bad trip right off the bat, which does happen to people, psychedelics tend to create evangelists, because right at first you're so excited about it. You have this amazing experience, and you feel like your life is profoundly changed and everything's going to be different from here on out. And then, slowly you come down off the high. Maybe you keep using them like I did, and you find that you can't. I guess I would say psychedelics do have that in common with other drugs, that you never are able to achieve the highs that you did in the beginning.
Right.
Like there are diminishing returns. And so I think psychedelics deliver, because it is like that fast track to transcendence. They deliver, or they make promises that they cannot keep, and that they cannot deliver. And so I think over time, like I think a lot about in the 60s, and I think Hunter S. Thompson wrote a couple, some paragraphs about this. Like you could almost see the high watermark in LA, where everything was so full of promise and full of hope. And I found it fascinating too. In Joan Didion's essay, Slouching Towards Bethlehem, she talks about how when the Manson murders happened, she said no one was surprised, because there was like this palpable tension that, there was so much psychedelic use, there was this palpable tension that something was going to break, like the dam was going to burst. And I just thought that was so fascinating. She said she remembers that, like, everyone, I can't remember the exact line. She said everyone was shocked, but no one was surprised. And so I think, yeah, psychedelics make promises that they can't ultimately deliver on.
This episode is brought to you by Stewardship, a Christian charity making generosity simple and intentional.
A Stewardship Giving Account gives you one place to manage all of your giving, regular or one-off, available 24/7.
Discover more at stewardship.org.uk.
That's really interesting. Jonathan Haidt talks about his experience of taking LSD, which I think he did in his late 20s, and he talks about it as like one of the things that has made his work what it is now and has made him, think the way he thinks now. I mean, he was already doing a PhD, but, he talks about it as this really valuable experience in that I think he said like everything was beautiful and dualisms were all transcended and all of this. I think he only did it once, so that's important to say. That, like you say, maybe a bit of this evangelist mindset. But it made me think, like, is there a tiny part of you that thinks there's any value? Maybe this is like, okay, if you can achieve this without psychedelics, perfect, but that thinks there's value in doing anything that like breaks down like the constructs that we've built around what we think we know. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like we get out of our materialism, our nihilism, our whateverism. Is there any value? Do you see any value in humans striving to break that down for themselves?
Yes, I just don't think psychedelics is a good way to do it.
Sure.
But yeah, absolutely. And I remember thinking, and I wrote about this in the book, after my first LSD experience, which was after maybe like 6 months to a year after the first psilocybin experience. It was a very I think I described it as, and this is the only term I can think of, like a very shattering experience. I felt like I didn't know who I was anymore. I felt like everything I knew had been turned on its head. I felt like, but it was very violent, if I can describe it that way. Like it wasn't, it wasn't healthy. Like I just remember like feeling like, what is reality? Like, is this solid wood? Like, what is the ground? What is time? Like, who am I? And not in it was in like a very violent way. And so I think, like Justin was talking about, these shortcuts, like it's not a spiritually healthy way to achieve those goals, which are good goals. Like you said, sometimes we do need to be broken out of our thinking. We do need to be, and I feel like God has done that for me several times without drugs, and it's been much more, the word that I always use, like my experiences of the presence of Jesus, and even feeling disciplined from God and feeling rebuked by God and feeling corrected, have been much gentler, like no less revelatory, I guess, or no less, and have been also created more lasting change, and have been cleaner in a way. Clean is a strange word to use, but I guess pure would be another word, like pure in a way that psychedelics never were. And I think another thing about psychedelics, once you know how bad a bad trip can get, there's really like no going back from that knowledge. Like, you have the fear. I guess you could liken it to falling off a horse, or, you have the fear. And so yeah, to answer your question, I absolutely think that there's value in that. Yet I just think psychedelics are fraught with so much danger, spiritual danger. And if you look too at, there are the isolated stories of people encountering Jesus on psychedelics, and I would just attribute that to God can do whatever he wants, like God can reach people wherever they are. But much more often, I personally have encountered stories of people abandoning the Christian faith because of psychedelics, of people. I feel like if there is any reliable spiritual beliefs that emerge from psychedelics use, which it's wildly disparate, it's wildly varied, but if there is like a pattern that you can kind of tease out. It's more pantheistic beliefs, like beliefs in oceanic consciousness, like all is love, and we are all one, that kind of thing.
I was going to ask, we do want to come to sort of the more recent part of your journey in a moment, which is, you know, how you found your way towards Christian faith in the end, you know, as you started to experience the more negative side of the hallucinogenics. But just turning to something you have mentioned in passing, which is the fact that there is a real interest in the potential medicinal value of psychedelics at the moment. There have been some studies done. You sound like you're skeptical about the, you know, the kind of data it's producing, but I've certainly heard of, you know, people talking about the psychological possibilities, the way that mental health issues, anxiety, depression, and so on, can be treated by the use of, I think, you know, microdoses or you know, very limited sort of amounts, not sort of what's the word for it when you have like a hero dose or whatever, when it's like,
Oh
you
yeah,
know, a
heroic
complete kind of
dose.
yeah.
Uh-huh.
But the just in the way that I suppose people have also vouched for the possible use of medicinal cannabis and so on, that even though these things can be misused, there might be a positive use for them as well under the right circumstances, in clinical circumstances. So what's your overall view of that possibility?
Yeah, and I think it's funny now thinking of like heroic dose is such a propaganda term, you know. I mean, I know plenty of people who have taken heroic doses and we're not heroes, but yeah, you know, I think that is the question that I've struggled with the most, just because like, how do you argue with someone's subjective experience? If they say, yes, this broke me out of a years long depression. Yes, this made me a better person. And I think there is that potential, like Belle was saying, there is that potential of breaking people out of ways of thinking. But I would ask, like, what is the cost of that? And what is the cost of doing that through psychedelics? And I think too, you know, like I've had people email me after I've been on podcasts and saying like, well, I've had a couple like graduate students who are studying psychedelics saying like, well, you know, I've really observed these positive changes. I myself have experienced positive changes, and I guess my primary response to that, like I said, it's hard to refute someone's subjective experience. You know, I wouldn't necessarily want someone doing that to me, saying like, well, you're wrong. You say you've changed, you're wrong. You know, you say that. But I just think the way that God designed us to function is in community, and specifically in Christian fellowship. And I've just come to believe like that's where true transformation happens. And so, yeah, you can go off in the woods and take a heroic, quote unquote, heroic dose of psilocybin and come back and say you've been profoundly changed. But who is observing those changes in you? Like who are you accountable to, I guess? And in a lot of cases, I feel like, well, no one, you know? And so I've just come to think that, yeah, I guess that's how I would respond to that. And I do think I have a friend who's a Presbyterian reverend who's done a lot of work on this. Like a lot of those studies are really deeply ethically flawed, as far as there being a lot of cross-pollination between the people who are funding the study are also participating in the study and like calibrating the data and interviewing the participants. And so just these like massive conflicts of interest that aren't disclosed. And so yeah, that's a whole nother story. That's a big mess. And I think really calls into question, I guess, the results. And of course, news media, you know, they love to take these studies and draw really sensationalistic headlines out of them. Like I think by now Newsweek and Time magazine have had covers about like, you know, could this be the next miracle cure for depression? And you know, with pictures of psilocybin mushrooms. But then when you go and actually read the studies, the results like aren't nearly as dramatic as those headlines would seem to suggest.
Yeah, and you always run the risk, I suppose, you know, for every good news story, that there are going to be those bad news stories.
Oh yeah,
I
for sure.
was reading the autobiography of a British comedian you may not know, Bob Mortimer, here in the UK, and there's just a fascinating moment in his autobiography where he talks about as a student just this one time he took LSD basically, and it profoundly it turned him into a kind of reclusive, sort of
Yeah.
anxiety-ridden person for about 3 or 4 years. He said until
Wow.
it kind of
Yeah.
wore off. But
Yeah.
that is one example of where it's clearly had exactly the opposite effect of what people are talking
I've
about.
heard
And
stories like that too. Sorry,
yeah,
what was the
yeah.
name?
Bob Mortimer, he's just an iconic comedy sort of person here in the UK, but you may not have come across him. I think you'd like his humour actually.
Yeah.
If you look up Reeves and Mortimer, Ashley,
Okay.
you might find something you've never seen before. But they're comedy gold. Anyway, Belle, over to you.
I've just got the national treasure Bob Mortimer in my mind now. I would love, Ashley, I really want to ask you about Christianity, because everyone that I know who no, not everyone, but so many people I know who enjoy psychedelics, it's the limitlessness of it. It's like that, like you've said, like all is all, like love is love, anything is possible. And so in that sense, they are super spiritual, and they're quite soft to spirituality.
Yeah.
But what feels like might be their absolute nightmare is if someone came to them and said, no, now pin that down to one specific religious tradition, please. You know, like confine yourself. And like, I'm thinking about the byline of your book, right? Like transcendence, psychedelics, like big, big. And then and Jesus Christ, you know, it's like limitless and a narrow path. And so I'm so intrigued about how you did that, how you were like, I am willing to tie all of this, like to tie all of my spiritual inklings and cravings and desires and make it specific and make it like quote unquote confined. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. And the short story is no, I was totally unwilling. I was open to anything but Christianity. I think that was one major effect of that first LSD trip that really was spiritual in a sense, though it was like violently, darkly spiritual. It opened me up to what felt like that limitlessness, what felt like this expanse of ideas that I'd never explored before. Oh, except no, not Jesus. No, not that.
Sure.
And but maybe because of my upbringing and also because of the spiritual powers that were at work, I think I was so arrogant about like, oh yeah, I know about that. Nope, that's not it. And so it was immensely humbling to finally realize, oh, actually that he is it. But and it makes me think too of, I had a good friend who I'm still friends with, and she actually has become a Christian, interestingly enough. But back in the day, she was just like I was, super new agey. She was she did energy healing and was just open to anything and everything, kind of like I was. And I remember after I became a Christian bringing up Jesus Christ to her, and she was so closed off to it. And like now I said, praise God, she has become a Christian, she and her husband have. But yeah, there was this, it's interesting, like you said, there is this feeling of limitlessness and like you want more of that. And there was also a hunger. I wrote about this in the book a lot. Like it felt like there was this compulsion behind it, my use of LSD. It became like more and more and more like there has to be an end to this. Like there has to be a goal. There has to be like an omega point where I'm going to, my mind is just going to be completely shattered and I'm going to be completely immersed. I don't know. I got to the point where it's like, I don't even know what it is or what I'm looking for or what's going to happen, but I feel compelled to keep going, keep exploring. And so I think, when I started having bad trips, things started going downhill, and I just felt this sense of desperation, like this path and this way that I was so sure was it is not working anymore. And it was such a profound relief to realize that I didn't have to do that anymore. Like that I could not save myself. I could not attain this knowledge. I could not be like God. Like I think that was also like the core underlying sin, is wanting to be like God. And I do think there's something analogous in psychedelics to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. and just craving this spiritual knowledge, and craving being like God and having the knowledge of God. And so there was such profound relief in encountering Jesus Christ and realizing that I couldn't save myself, and also realizing that he had been there, like any place, the darkest place that I had been on psychedelics, I wasn't
Sure.
alone. Like he had been there. It was such a profound relief. And I also wanted to say, I was thinking about when you were asking the question about the limitlessness that was once so appealing. One of my very favorite Psalms quickly became, when I actually started reading the Bible for myself, which I had never done before, and is still one of my favorite Psalms, is Psalm 131, which is like the one about I have calmed and quieted myself like a weaned child. And I do not concern myself with things too great for me. And like I have calmed and quieted myself. Like I just love that psalm, and it was such a balm to my soul. Like I don't have to carry that. I don't have to like I can let God be God, and I am not God, and I can let God be God, and I'm just me. So yeah, I think that limitlessness that is so appealing at the beginning, it becomes like a burden and a curse eventually.
Yes, there's a sense of freedom in realizing I don't have to know the cosmic mysteries of the universe. That's okay if God knows those, and I kind of am just
Yeah.
the person who experiences what I'm supposed to experience in my limited
Yes.
mortal
Yes.
mortal mortality. I mean, you tell very movingly as well in the book of that path to faith, and to Christian faith specifically in church, and of a friendship, and actually a tragedy as well, for that friend of yours, that sort of helped you to understand the way in which God could be present even in the most difficult parts of the normal everydayness of life, outside of the kind of the mystical realms of psychedelics. So do you just want to sort of sketch out some of what happened as you went on that journey?
Sure. Yeah. I had, so it was probably toward I don't know, the waning years of my arc with psychedelics. And I was becoming disenchanted. My husband and I had had a child, and that had kind of made me become disenchanted with I was also really heavily into yoga, meditation, and having a child really made me just become disenchanted with this idea that when we die, our identity is just reabsorbed into everything, and we lose any kind of individual identity is an illusion, and it's in fact like a hindrance and something to be escaped, which I think is kind of there's some overlap with Buddhism and Hinduism there. And so I was really became disenchanted with that idea when I was so overwhelmed with love for my son, and just looking at him and thinking about, I don't want him to be lost like forever. I don't want him to be, that's not beautiful like I thought it was. That's not wonderful and beautiful. That's ugly and scary, and I don't like it. And so I was kind of in this in between place where I felt this tension of not aligning with the things that I thought I had believed, but I also was still really opposed to Christianity. And at that time, I had a childhood friend who, I can't remember how, but somehow we got back in touch. She had began to have children as well. She had 2 children, and she would invite me over to her home, and she would come over to my home, and we would inevitably end up talking about spiritual things. She was a very devoted Christian, and I at the time, I was open at the time, I think, to like exploring kind of Christian adjacent ideas, in but only through the lens that Christianity was one of the many paths to God, and it was just a lens through which you could view this perennial path. And she would always really gently push back against that idea. She would quote scripture a lot, but just in a very gentle, loving way. Never like a scolding manner. Which is just who she is. She just has such a gentle, and I feel like that's also just a fruit of the spirit within her, is her gentleness. And she had a son who was a couple years older than my son, and then a daughter who was about the same age as my son. And in the course of all this, it was every couple of months we would get together. Her daughter became ill, and for a few weeks they couldn't really tell what was going on. She was just having a recurrent fever and some bleeding in her mouth, just kind of strange things. And they kept taking her to the doctor, and finally they got a diagnosis of leukemia. And she, it's still just hard for me to talk about. Her name was Joella, and she died 3 weeks after they got the diagnosis. Wow. So just like this really just hurricane of tragedy, totally unexpected, and it just happened so fast. And I remember going to her funeral, and I was pregnant again at the time with our oldest daughter. And I just remember thinking, like I said, all those ideas were percolating in my head of like, okay, I no longer believe that my son is just going to be absorbed into the all. He's going to lose his individual identity. And also just feeling like I don't understand what could sustain someone through something like this. Because I look at my child, I can't imagine losing him in this way. And I don't have anything that I could stand on if that happened. And so I'm just, crossing my fingers and, holding onto my crystals or whatever, that something like that doesn't happen. But what if something like that did happen? And it was just really, I don't know, bewildering and beautiful at the same time to see the way that she and her husband were sustained through that. That yes, they were heartbroken. Yes, they were devastated. But they weren't completely annihilated. Like they weren't destroyed. They obviously had something that was sustaining them. And I think that for me, witnessing that was just a huge piece of finally being willing to consider, like, maybe there is something to this Jesus person. Like maybe I should be a little more open to what my friend was telling me. And so, yeah, that was, it was incredibly tragic and so sad, but it was definitely a big turning point for me.
Is there something there about, so I do a lot of work reading about, speaking to and writing for those who are spiritual but not religious. So they believe in something, but they don't necessarily want to put a name to it. Many wouldn't even call it God, maybe just the universe, the something, the bigger than us. And what I'm always struck with that is however exciting that is, there can be no relationship with something that you can't know. And was it a bit of that as well, of like, okay, religion is scary because, it kind of, it gives me its explanation and I don't get to find that out for myself, although like you say, that becomes a relief. But there's relationship there as opposed to just like...
Yes.
I don't even know what you would call it, the opposite of relationship, but you know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. There's this vague concept of that there's something transcendent, and there's maybe, like you said, people will use, and I would use language about God. I would even say God sometimes, but the way that I viewed God didn't necessarily give him very much agency, or if it did, I didn't know, like, when I would say the universe, it's like, and people would say, the universe will give you what you need. Like, well, is the universe for me or against me? I don't really know.
What does the universe want and why?
Right. Yeah. Exactly. So, like you said, it's like people are afraid to narrow it down. But there's no relationship. And I think too, I remember one time thinking like, okay, if we are all one and we are all collectively in some sense God, but there's also maybe this transcendent something too. Like if we're all, then we're all alone. Like it's just, and that thought was terrifying to me. Like if we're all one, then we're all alone. And like, so, and like you said, there's no relationship. There's no, so those ideas too, like that openness also became a terror to me in a way. Like it became a burden, and it became scary.
It's been such a helpful conversation with you as you've navigated some of these moments and experiences through your life, and very moving to hear as well of some of those things that brought you to Christian faith in the end. Ashley, you've written this book, both to tell your story to potentially warn against some of these dangers you've spelled out around the pursuit of enchantment through psychedelics, and to, I suppose, to advocate for Christian faith. But what would be your advice to churches where they want to reach people who are looking for this enchantment? And this is what this podcast series exists for as well. We want to sort of say there is a huge craving for the mystery and the mystical and so on. But very often it feels like Western Christianity has sort of somehow been stripped of that, and people, what they should have found in the church and in worship and in prayer, for some reason it's been missing for a while, and so they've gone to the psychedelics and the the Eastern gurus or whatever, to look for it again. What should the church be doing? Not necessarily putting its thumbs up to psychedelics, but is there something it could do that sort of seeks to meet that craving, but obviously through a Christ-centered lens?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I think you're right about the kind of disenchantment, I guess, of a lot of corners of Western Christianity. I think just, yeah, acknowledging that more, that spiritual warfare is always occurring, that it's a reality. I think when I was first coming out of psychedelic use into Christianity, when we first became Christians, we attended a non-denominational church. And then, but eventually I discovered like the charismatic tradition and Pentecostalism. And I was really attracted to that just because there was such a focus on spiritual realities. And I think there can definitely be, pitfalls to that kind of, to that tradition in particular. But I think, just there needs to be an acknowledgement of that. And also I think churches really need to understand, like we were talking about earlier, that psychedelics are a different class of substances and experiences than are produced by things like heroin and cocaine and meth, that you're dealing with, I think, genuine encounters with the spiritual realm there. And so I think, realizing that if you have, and I do think that, like I said, because psychedelics cannot deliver on the promises that they make, that there will be a lot of people, that there are now, and there will be in the years to come, a lot of people seeking solid ground, I guess, to stand on after having had all these psychedelic experiences. And I don't know, I have found I love the church that we currently attend and are very committed to. We absolutely love. It's a wonderful community, but it would be considered like a low church. And I have found myself attracted to liturgies, like we have a book of common prayer that we use sometimes at home. There's something, I don't know. I think it's interesting. There's something, maybe it's the attraction of that solid ground, but I feel like there's something really attractive about those liturgies. And I've noticed too that seem to be a lot of people who come out of psychedelic use and are really attracted to kind of flood into Eastern Orthodoxy, because I feel like in Eastern Orthodoxy there seems to be, and I guess, because that's not Western Christianity, there seems to be more of an appreciation of the mystical and an appreciation of the importance of beauty. So I think that's another thing that Western Christianity has lost a bit of, like that. Like, yes, we can worship anywhere. We can have a church in a strip mall, but like losing that, maybe like somehow apprehending or like reintegrating an appreciation for the importance of beauty, even in like small ways, that, okay, like we don't have the money to build a beautiful cathedral, but like in small ways, I think would go a long way. Yeah.
I think that's really helpful. And everything you've said there chimes brilliantly with so many guests we've had in previous seasons talking about, the attraction of Eastern Orthodoxy, about beauty, talking about, we had someone you may be familiar with, Ian McGilchrist, a year or so ago, talking about the, this left and right hemispheric way of viewing the world. And I think what you're describing there is almost like Christianity needs to regain its right hemispheric kind of way of seeing everything through the lens of beauty, tradition, meaning, rather than just sort of let's look at the Bible and divide it into X many verses and talk about that for half an hour.
Right.
It's much. It's not that's not important, but there's many there's a wider way of engaging the reality of Christian faith and without having to necessarily become a Pentecostal charismatic. There are all these traditions. I think there's something in there that can be used to seek that meaning and that transcendence that you obviously found so compelling, but ultimately was a dead end in the way you were trying to get there through psychedelics. But I wish we had more time. We always say this, don't we, Val? We wish we had more time.
We always mean it, though.
But no, really fantastic to hear your journey. Thank you for sharing so candidly as well. And I suppose caveat here to say you're in no way, you're being very clear in this book, even though obviously some people do find their way to God, after going through psychedelics. You're not saying it's worth taking that gamble, as it were. This is not a kind of a pathway that you recommend
not prescriptive.
But the book itself, wonderful to read. Maybe a good one to pass on to someone who's interested in these issues as well. So we'll make sure there's a link to that from today's show, Ashley. But for now, thank you so much for coming on Re-Enchanting with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
It's been a joy. So The Thing That Would Make Everything Okay Forever is Ashley's book. You can find it in the show notes. You can also find links to Seen and Unseen, where you can find articles on so many of the topics that we've discussed today, and seenandunseen.com/give if you want to make future conversations of Re-Enchanting happen. It is a joy to be back with you for season 8 of Re-Enchanting. We will see you next time, but for now, goodbye.
Goodbye.